I'm like Kim Kardashian. I broke the internet. Instead of with my body, it was with my razzmatazz. Oh my God, it's here at last. It's our pod. It's our podcast. What's it called? The Showrunner Show. The topic's very niche, so away we go. I don't know. Kind of phoned that one in, but.
The topic's very niche. I like that.
I was impressed.
It's the same lyrics as making Craig do "What's it called?" and "Do you own a horse?" Before that was all it's exactly the same.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Showrunner Show, where every week we demystify some aspect of the job of showrunning for anyone who works in TV, who wants to work in TV, or just wants to know how it's all made. I'm Drew Dowdle.
I'm John Eric Dowdle.
And I'm Stacy Shabosky. Thank you so much for joining us. This is going to be a really good one. This is a part 2.
Part 2 with Rich Fox.
Yep. This week we want to give you some tools for fixing a broken episode. Like if you're, you show up in editorial and for whatever reason this episode doesn't quite work. It may not have, the pace. Maybe it wasn't, your season's best episode or just went off the rails for some reason. And you show up and you watch an episode and you're like, oh, this doesn't work. We wanted to just talk through like some go-to tools, to have in your toolbox for that kind of a situation.
How do you fix it? Yeah.
And I would just want to say, too, like, this happens on every season of TV. There will be an episode, usually somewhere in the middle, that isn't working, and it's not anyone's fault, per se. It just is kind of the way it goes. And but the upside is it is fixable. It's always fixable.
It's always fair. And
Almost.
I mean, this has happened on our own, episodes that we directed that
totally.
see one of the things, we direct ourselves and we're like, oh, what did I do wrong? And then you put it through the works and it ends up being like, sometimes it's like the great episodes right out of the gate are the ones you don't spend enough time on. And those end up being the duds when you actually watch the season. And it's the broken episodes that you spend all your focus on end up becoming the sparkling jewels of the season.
True.
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah.
Rich, do you find that too?
Yeah, I love this topic. It's so much fun to talk about and think about because, like you said, it always happens every season. There's always going to be a dud. And like you said, it's usually no one's fault. Sometimes I find that like in a cross-bordered episode, one of them is amazing and one of them like totally falls flat and it's the same director. So you're like, how could that happen? I don't know. My own personal speculation is maybe it's hard for everyone to track like 2 episodes at a time and everyone had the story very focused on one episode and another was just kind of shot and not really like as engaging. Because that's how I feel when I see an episode that falls flat. The one thing I feel like they have in common is like there's just not a confidence in the storytelling, right? It's like the scenes are there. It's maybe not even terrible. It's just we don't understand as an audience, like, what are we getting from this? Like, what? It's not dynamic in that way. It's not drawing me in, And who knows why that happened, whether it was the script or, again, whether when it was being shot, there just wasn't as much attention to detail paid to some of those, like, story points. But like you said, the good news is in editorial, you can address a lot of them. You can do things to prop it up, to make the episode feel more confident and more purposeful is a word I like to use.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Purposeful. That's good.
I love that.
Yeah, I love that too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like you're saying, you can't sometimes totally put your finger on what's not working about it. It's not engaging you, and that's such a like esoteric idea of like why isn't it engaging you? And it's I like the word purposeful. That's really good.
What about meaning? Could you, because that's, at first I thought you were talking about meaning of like, I'm not quite sure what this is supposed to mean in the story. Like, what does it mean for the characters and their relationship? What does it mean for the overall plot? Like, why did you bother to put this scene in? Like, what does it mean in terms of how things have changed for this character or this relationship or this evolving story? Is that another way to look at it?
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it because I feel like with episodes like this, you almost have to go back to the beginning. You almost have to say, why did we write this episode? Why is this part of our story, right? And really think about if we have to communicate one thing in this episode, what is it? Because sometimes in an episode that's not working, there's maybe too many ideas, right? It's like a lot of times there's a lot of exciting things going on, but we're not pulled through the narrative with like one thread. So I feel like having that taking a step back and having that conversation, with the writers about like what was the purpose of this initially. Maybe that got lost along the way. Maybe we can now rediscover it in the editing process. Maybe these other threads of the story aren't important and we lower them and we find a way to bring up the main story. If we can achieve that, then we've got something here.
Yeah.
I love that.
That's great. And how do you bring up the main story? Like how do you bring that more to the foreground? What are some, to drill into that process?
Yeah, it's a really good question because it's a little intimidating at first. And I find sometimes like when I'm needing to start fresh on an episode, I find sometimes just like take all the music out, right? Like have it be now a fresh experience because you get attached to certain things and certain transitions. Mm-hmm. It's like get rid of that and just look at the story, right? And just rethink every scene in terms of like what is it telling us and really be open to not what you were trying to do when you cut it or someone else cut it, but like what is it telling me now? And then sometimes you just start seeing new things like, well, yeah, this scene is. Sometimes you're like, well, this scene is almost the opposite of what the intention is for this episode. And I didn't even realize that the first time I caught it or when I put in the episode. But now I'm realizing it's like, no, it's making this character seem the opposite of what we want, or it's confusing the story. It's giving me another thought that is almost in contrast to the main thought. So how do you address that? Do you cut out that story point, or do you just kind of like hide it in a scene? I mean, as you know, with performances, right? There's a lot you can do to kind of hide a performance that's not as good and not have them be on camera as much. And, those are similar things with story points of like have less of it, have a scene stop early, maybe it's not cutting a whole scene. I find one trick in these episodes is like, what's the part of the scene that's helping us? I usually start with that. Maybe it's these 3 lines are helping us with the story. And the beginning of the scene and the ending of the scene is not. So maybe there's a way to just come into those 3 lines and get out. Now, all of a sudden, you've emphasized the part of the story that you do want. Mm-hmm. Another trick that I find with these episodes is like, is there a way to connect scenes that maybe in the writing weren't connected, but now we say, okay, what if we put like one piece of score through these 4 scenes and take the audience on a little mini journey here of like, this is all one thought, and again, that's a way to make it feel purposeful. Like we intended to do this. We intended for these 4 scenes to be a montage or a sequence, whereas maybe it wasn't in the script and maybe it wasn't in the first version of editorial, but now we're making it that more purposeful. So, again, thinking of sequences, like how do you connect? Because like when you're watching a show, it's like scenes build on other scenes. The momentum from one scene carries into the next scene. And I think in some episodes that aren't working, you lose that, right? Like the energy sometimes will deflate. You get to a good point and then a second half of a scene, maybe it dies and you lose the focus. So sometimes just try something bold. It might not work, but what if you just like connect this part of this scene, this part of this scene, this part of this scene, put some music through it and see what happens. And maybe all of a sudden new connections are made between those parts of those scenes.
I love that.
I love that too.
I once heard an editor say kind of a version of this. Like they were like, oh, in the writer's room with the studio network will be like, hey, we don't touch on this storyline in Act 2 and in Act 3. Like, make sure we wind the storyline through every act. And so what happens in the writer's room is you tend to like take these storylines and pepper them throughout the entire episode.
Totally.
And he said, when an episode's not working, one thing you can do is just cluster all the storylines together and not worry about touching every storyline in every act. But like clustering, and it's a version of what you're saying is like creating sequences out of scenes instead of every scene is resetting to a whole new storyline.
Yeah.
And sometimes on the page, what is asked for, is one thing, but in editorial, really the flow is better, when you put things together. And even though it may look, irregular on a script page, in the flow of the episode, it actually really works.
Yeah, I would like to just expand on that. It always amazes me how much, how often in the notes there's that opinion of like, pepper out the storylines, like kind of even spread through the episode. You get those notes a lot in the writer's room, and then you can deliver something in post that totally reshuffles the deck of that episode, and no one has any, you never get that note in post. You never get, well, can we spread that out? Like it's a weird disconnect between, it might be the same people giving you the notes and the scripts as in post, but there's like such an, disconnect for some reason when you're, you almost have total flexibility to kind of restructure an episode in post without any pushback, if it's working, and it's kind of amazing. And, and to your point, Rich, I remember this was not an episode we were doing together, but I think mid-season episodes can tend to have can kind of fall victim to that idea of like, you have to move 6 storylines forward, and you successfully do that in the episode, but it doesn't, lack that common thread or what's the most important thing. It can just kind of feel like pushing everything forward and can be successful doing that, but it somehow doesn't engage you. And I had one episode in Joe Pickett where it's like, middle of the episode, Joe starts his day, just does his things, got some normal things going on. And then like the important thing happens. And then Mary Beth, goes about her day and does a couple things. And then the important thing happens. And it was just like a slog, just kind of editing it as it was written. It just felt like a slog to get through this. And the editor on that one was just like, maybe we just trim this way down. We jump back and forth between the two. We give it a great piece of music and we just make it like this one day's montage that leads to the big thing for both of them at the same time. And that like idea and that recut just made it all completely work. And it was just so different than it was on the page. And it's, kind of exactly what you're saying. It's just, kind of getting to the core of what's important here and what, how quickly can we get to the important thing and kind of just fly through this montagey stuff. And, sometimes you just need a montage.
There's going to be a montage. Remember how funny that was? There's going to be a montage.
So
kill me. Okay, so that would be like more intercutting. That would be
more intercutting or just
sometimes.
Maybe the point I'm trying to make, in all this long-winded way is sometimes it's just abandoning the structure of the script and saying, put it aside completely, and how do we make this sing with what we have? And it often can look very, very different than what it did on the page.
In the writer's room, like we actually, so, whether you're using Writer's Room Pro because you're doing a virtual room, or whether you're in person or you're actually using like colored index cards, each storyline gets its own color. So maybe the A line is blue, and then maybe like, one of the subplots is pink, and they're attached to characters, obviously, because each, so maybe Joe's blue and Mary Beth is pink, not to be all gendered stuff. And then honestly, at some point you shuffle the cards, you have all those storylines, then you start mixing them up and being, oh, that'd be a good act out. Oh, that'd be a good, and you start mixing them up. And what you want in the room will actually like sit back and congratulate each other. We'll go, oh, that's very pretty. It's very pretty cards. Like we want it to look like a pretty little blue, pink, white, blue. Like we want it to be this pretty little...
It's nice even spread, yeah.
Oh, a nice even spread of delightful little colors. And we kind of pat ourselves on the back. And I wonder if it's just got to be that way because you're working with two different media. Media, is media the plural? Yeah. Like a script is a written thing. You're reading it, and a bunch of people have to read it, and a bunch of people have to read it over the course potentially of years without getting bored. So it has to work in that medium, But then when it's actually a TV show, it's a completely different medium. Nobody's reading it anymore. And so maybe it's not, because I hear that and I go, oh, we should skip over the part where we mix up the colors. We should just go ahead and bulk them together at first. Let's just skip over that process. But I kind of suspect maybe you couldn't.
It's a funny thing. It's like, it reminds me kind of like the Mike Tyson quote. I'm paraphrasing, but it's like,
it's not something you hear every day.
It's like, it's easy to have a plan until you get punched in the face. It's like when you see an episode and you're like, oh, this episode sucks. You're like, everything that was precious to you like 10 minutes before, you're like, I don't care. Let's just make this episode, whatever it takes. Let's make this episode great. I don't get like, there was a scene I loved and I like absolutely insisted be shot, even though everyone was like, I'm not sure this works. It's like, it's going to be great. And then you see it and it bogs down the episode and you're like, kill it. Like, I don't like
get rid of it.
Are we talking about the goat mayor?
That's exactly what I was talking about. Yeah.
if I were the Joe Pickett showrunner, not only would that goat mayor scene still be there, it would be the opening scene. I don't know how I'd make it work. Rich, we'll figure it out together.
Gary the goat.
I think we cut that scene.
yeah.
I think we tried.
That was you and me together.
Yeah, we went through a couple of versions of like, okay, if this scene can exist, maybe this way, maybe that way. We tried, I think, 3 different ways, and eventually you said, you know what, we're abandoning this one. This one's out the window. It can't be saved, and that's
My favorite part of the Gary the Goat saga is that scene no longer exists in the show, but there's still a gigantic framed portrait of a goat in the police station for no apparent reason.
Well, they mentioned
they see him at Deer Days.
He's
at
at Deer Days.
Right. He does it at Deer Days. That's right.
PETA. Did PETA come down hard on you guys for killing the goat?
I mean, in editorial, not in real life.
Yeah. But to your point, John, too, like in the writing process, it's like there's so many rules and so many like, you can't not see your lead until Act 3. That's a problem. We have to see, our lead in Act 1, and then you get an editorial, and none of those rules exist. Like, it works better. Nobody misses your lead at all until Act 3. It's fine. You're at minute 20, and it's cool. And you suddenly have far less constraints in editorial.
I gotta ask, because like I said, I haven't really done this process. Do you really mean that, like, none of the rules apply, or do you mean none of the rules apply when the episode is bad? Do the rules usually apply?
Yeah, I think
Is
if
this
it
anarchy?
works better, when you can see the episode and you can tell it works better, doing something unconventional, then I think very few rules apply in editorial, honestly.
I think there's principles that help you get there, though. Like, I liked, one of the things you were saying, Drew, is like just starting the episode, like defining what this episode should be, and then starting that storyline earlier, whatever it is. Like,
whatever it is.
If you're going to pull a storyline forward, like, have it happen earlier in the episode. Like often it's I find like it's the coming into the episode. It may just be setting up the episode a little too much, or, like laying the groundwork for the episode and getting right into it. Even if you then do like 5 days earlier, or you know what I mean? Like, but getting into it fast, something big and bold up top to like really pull you in. Hopefully it's the main storyline. I do find like that as a principle, I find really can be helpful, and just give the audience the feeling of like, okay, I know what I'm watching. I know what this episode's about now, and I can relax into it, as opposed to sometimes if it takes too long to like, what is this? I don't know what I'm supposed to be tracking here. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I love everything you guys are saying about the difference between like the script process and the rules and the editorial process, and that it's so important to be aware of that as we like start making changes to an episode, and try to make it work, because like you said, it's like, so for example, I find often in a script, when 2 scenes are intercut together, it's not always successful, right? I think it's got to be very hard without seeing the performances and without feeling every beat as it's played to know how to cut from one to the other.
Yeah.
Whereas when I have 2 scenes together, that kind of tells me how I can go back and forth between them. I have so much more information about like, where is that pause? Where does this little part of the scene end? And that connects to this part of this scene. I find I can be a lot more successful sometimes in like making 2 scenes combine into one. And that sometimes is a great way to something to do on an episode like this that's not feeling purposeful, is to like, what if these 2 scenes are together? What's the story that's in both of these scenes that can ping pong off each other? And that's just, I think you would never know that when you were writing the 2 scenes, because they both work probably on paper individually great. But when you look at the whole episode and a story is not popping, suddenly that's an opportunity to like combine these 2 scenes into one. And again, it's just, the editorial process makes it possible, whereas it probably wasn't before.
That's great.
That is great. Maybe we could talk about the note that every episode gets 100% of the time in our experience is, great episode. Can you take 5 minutes out of it? That's a note you get every time. And I'd say as a general rule, what starts as an editor's cut goes to director's cut, goes to showrunner cut, to the studio and network cuts. It it tends to get shorter every step of the way. And maybe we could talk about like, just some of the tricks as far as, okay, you just have for whatever reason, a mandate that 5 minutes need to come out. And what is your approach going through if the showrunner is saying, I love everything in this episode, how do we find 5 minutes?
Right. Right.
That's going to break the episode. I love it all. Like, what are we going to do?
Right. So great question. You need to take 5 minutes out of an episode, and there's not a whole scene to cut. There's not everything obvious, and everyone's attached to different parts. I will find, usually at first, I do want to look for some chunks to cut, right? I don't want to start trimming 10 frames here, 10 frames there, because then you're changing the pacing of the whole episode and just squeezing it down. I had one showrunner say, there's always more air to cut. We don't need to cut any dialogue. You can always find air. And, this was in an NBC show where you had to get down to an exact time. So there was something to that sometimes the air can go. He wasn't completely wrong. That is one trick, is like going through a scene and realizing, oh, the space between these two lines is how they performed it. That's not necessarily the space that we need between them to play the scene. And so I could do an air pass and maybe take out a minute or two, and it probably will make the episode better. If I'm careful and I don't ruin a performance, if I'm very deliberate about it, the episode will feel paced up in a way that's nice. So that's one trick. But usually I don't think cutting air is going to get you all the way there, and you reach a point where you don't want to mess with it anymore because the pacing is good. So I find there's almost always, a couplet in a scene that can go. Even if everyone thinks the scene is perfect, sometimes I'll just try it and see if anyone misses it. I may ask, I might not ask, because if you see the scene and it's great, and then I'll tell you, is it okay that I cut those lines out, just so you're aware of it. I'm not trying to sneak it past you, right? But at least then you're looking for 10-second chunks that really help. And again, a lot of times the scene just got stronger. It's well, we didn't need that back and forth. That's actually repetitive of what they said over here.
Will you please define a couplet for me in this? I think I know what you're saying, but I've never heard that in these terms.
Oh, I think of a couplet as an exchange between two characters, right? It's one character will say something, the other character will respond. That I think of as one couplet. And a lot of times I look for those in terms of what to trim out of a scene, because a lot of times you look at the written word and you realize, oh, well, if we go from this exchange to this exchange, it flows perfectly. These two lines are actually not necessary. And I'm sure there was some reason they were written. And a lot of times when I talk to writers, it's oh yeah, we got these notes. We kind of had to squeeze this idea into the scene. And that's a perfect example where you're given notes, you squeeze something into a scene, but now this is our opportunity to take those unnecessary ideas out of the scene. And now, like you said, you're not going to get the note anymore. No. You're going to get the notes, the scenes too. The same person that told you to put more into the scene is now going to tell you the scene's that's too long.
Exactly correct.
Where are you going to cut? And it's okay, great. So now I can ignore everything you said before and take out everything that we don't need. And usually in a scene, there's those moments where, again, the flow is stronger without a couple of the diversions. So
I bet it's more realistic to human nature, because I feel that's one thing. When you listen to how people actually talk in real life, it's definitely not as rational or as it makes more jumps than it does usually in written dialogue. In written dialogue, and I can definitely be for myself, I have a tendency to want to squeeze in every cool line that anyone thought of, and to handhold the audience all the way through. So there's a logical oh, we go from this topic and resolve it. Now we're at this topic, and that's not really how people speak. So it makes sense to me that it would also be probably artistically more human to pull out some chunks.
Yeah.
And I'd like to expand too on the note idea. If you're willing to trust the process, and play the long game with notes, and as a showrunner, if you get notes that hey, we really want to insert this idea into the scene, you can add it. And then you can kind of use editorial as a way to filter things back out. And you know what I mean? If you still find it doesn't fit, you don't have to fight every battle on the day. If you're playing the long game and you have a long-term way of looking at it, there's always going to be time to take out the line if you don't like really
Yeah.
believe it's perfect. You can try it, but yeah, then you're not being combative, but you're still potentially getting the scene the way it was intended.
And once in a while, that ad might actually be helpful, but but when it's not, and it is a diversion, usually the actors will flag it on the day of like, why do we have to say this? And you might have to tell them like, hey, it's a note. Let's just keep in the scene. But if it doesn't work in editorial, you'll take it out, and you'll have the opportunity to do that then. Because Rich, you're so right. Like the same person who wanted it in is going to then tell you the scene's too long. And so
It's so true. That's
and nobody is
so
tracking anything from the writer's room to editorial, as far as like,
Right.
they didn't take this note from, the writer's room that I
Right.
gave. Like nobody's paying that close of attention, I don't think. And
yeah,
it's just
especially
all
if
about
there
how-
wasn't a fight. If
Yeah,
there was a
especially
fight
those-
over a
Right.
Yeah.
line, and
Then they're paying attention.
and
Yeah.
it was dug
Yeah.
in on both sides, and this
Yeah.
line became a thing.
Yeah.
Then everyone's watching that line. If
Yeah,
it was
it's-
never a fight, nobody remembers it.
That's such
Right.
a good point. That is such a good point.
Being the covering writer on set, something that would come up a lot is actors might want to take out a line, like you guys are saying, like, I don't really like this, doesn't really fit. Could I just not say it? And usually I would call you guys like, they don't like it, it doesn't fit. Can we take it out? And your point, I'd say 99 times out of 100 is, well, you can get rid of something that you shot, but you can't not shoot something and then have it suddenly appear as if by magic. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't work in reverse.
It's exactly right. Yeah. Usually actors will play ball, even if you're kind of saying, if we don't need it, we'll cut it. Usually actors will play ball unless they just really feel so strongly about it. And
if they
Right.
trust you, and if they trust you
trust
to
you.
like
Yeah.
to do a good job in editorial, because some actors have been burned by
Yeah.
like, okay, I'll do this line even though I don't believe in it, and then that's the centerpiece of the scene when they see the episode, and it, what I mean, like if I feel like we've created knock on wood some real trust with our actors and on our shows, and it helps us have that conversation, like we'll put eyes on it if it does, like I don't know, that I could see that not always being true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, back to Rich's, points about pacing up a scene. And I have to say, one of my favorite experiences that totally proves me wrong every time is when there's a scene that's like, let's say it's 3 minutes long, and I love it. I think it's just perfect. I don't want to take out anything. And then, Rich, he'll come and be like, I found a way to shrink that scene. I'm like, no, but it's great. It's great. It's great. And then you see like the 1 minute version of that scene. And it's like, God damn, he's right. It's so good. It's so good. And I didn't need any of those things I thought I needed. And it's so quick and like impactful in its brevity. That ceases to blow my mind how many times I'm, because I can tend to be too precious about, at least my own episodes. I definitely am. And, but that always shocks me and amazes me, and then just makes me happy when I see how often less is more. And, you guys are, Rich in particular is so good at finding the core of what matters in a scene, and not, lingering. And that's, there's value in that.
Yeah.
Right. It's always great to like give it a try, and try a scene and be open to the shorter version. And there's times when it's not better, and and that's why like I trust you guys to like, I know I can experiment with something and push it a little bit and try, and that you guys are going to watch it with fresh eyes and say, you know what, I missed something, or we had something before that we lost. I mean, that happens too, right?
Definitely.
Sometimes I'm like, we can lose these lines, and you guys are like, no, that's actually really important. It plays into the next episode, or this is why this is important, and that's where, it's good to just be open to try things, but also it's good to say, nope, we tried this. There was a note. We have ruined this scene. We have the confidence to say, we're going back to this version of the scene that we like, and we're going to tell them we're just not doing this note because we know we made it worse.
Yeah. It really is. You have to almost push it too far to then bring it back to see like, what is the shortest version of the scene that works before we break it? And then, John you and I do this all the time where, you're so good at just saying like, let's just, shrink it to absolutely what we need. You can be so good at being non-precious, and then I'll be like, what about these two couplets are really important. You really need them. We have a lot of that.
Totally. John's
tug of war
start
going.
from scratch dowdle. I feel like you will throw out an entire draft, and I'll like cling to my one line, like no, like let's just write the whole thing from scratch. Like what? What? No.
I know. I like change. I do. I have a
Rich,
it's that ADD side of me is like, okay, let's change everything.
Rich, do you when you look at it like big picture, do you also try to, again, I don't know anything about editing. Do you try to mix up the rhythm of the scenes? That if it falls into a pattern, like each scene is 2.5 minutes long, would it, kind of zone everyone out? Are you supposed to mix it up?
Yes, I think that is a great point, because I think, in an episode that's not working, sometimes it's not dynamic enough. That's another word I like to use, of like the scenes are all cut a little bit straightforward in a way that you'd expect, and the scenes are about the same length, and the music is kind of consistent. Sometimes the music is just kind of always there. So making it more dynamic is really important, right? Whether, it's like finding like highs and lows, like let's have this part pace up. So then when we slow down for this longer scene, we've kind of earned it. I'm always like trying to feel the energy of an episode. I think that's another thing I hone in on when an episode is not working, right? It's like, where is the energy? There's like sometimes when some sequences are so exciting and that energy carries into the next part, and then you can settle into a very slow sequence and it feels great to do that, right? Yeah. There's other times when an episode has been slow and then you settle into another slow sequence and now you're just completely bored. Yeah. And that slow part is the same, right? But it can work or not work depending on what came before it. So to your point, finding places where if we pace up this part and make it more exciting, then this part's going to work great when it's slow. I find that applies to music. Sometimes it needs to be more dynamic. Sometimes it needs to get a lot bigger at points and really become about the music. And then other times just completely go away for a long time and make sure you're leaving enough time that it's dry so the audience doesn't get used to like there's always music in the background, because it affects you more when it's silent and then all of a sudden something happens. So that's a really good like kind of rethink on an episode, is like the pacing of scenes, the ups and downs, and the music, and how all that affects the energy of what's pulling people through.
That's so articulately said. I love that. Just like the same exact scene can feel totally different just depending on what comes before it. I think that's it's hard not to, as a director or showrunner, like look at your notes from scene to scene and think of each scene almost as an individual entity, but it's not that. And that's such a, I don't know, that's really eye-opening.
Yeah. Right. And sometimes I think it's something that people don't do, is to take a step back and to watch a whole episode, It's like we get too focused on like this scene. Sometimes you just need to watch the whole thing and don't press stop and watch it, right? Because again, it all builds on itself and it all affects each other. And sometimes you're going to make discoveries about the pacing by watching it through and having the whole experience.
Yeah. That's great. And I love what you're saying too, like the more score or less score, or more music and less music, like that being one of those, knobs you can turn back and forth. And sometimes it's counterintuitive. We had an action movie we did, a while back that we saw an early editor's cut, and it had like kind of wall to wall, like dun 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 dun, dun, like, like kind of actiony music. And there was a lot of it. And the experience watching the film in that way was kind of exhausting, and it just felt like the music was trying to push the audience to feel something that it wasn't trusting was there, or so, something. And what we did is we took out the music, and then we said, what if we scored this action movie like a drum? Like, what if we scored the emotion, not the action, and we put music back in, totally a different, focus. And suddenly it felt so much more exciting, even though you're taking out the exciting music and putting in something that it almost seems like it's trying to like calm it down. And that interplay, really brought it to life in a way. Sometimes you need music to carry you through a scene, but sometimes that music actually makes the scene feel slower.
Do you ever watch stuff with subtitles on? Like I'll do that sometimes when I'm like, I'll work out and watch a show at the same time. So I'll throw the subtitles on. Or if people are British and I'm like, I don't understand a damn word. I'll put the subtitles on. And they always, I don't know who does the subtitles, but they always include an adjective or two for the music when the score will begin. And they do such a great job. They'll do like wistful, upbeat music. And you're like, it is wistful and upbeat. Edgy, energetic music. Yeah.
Is there any like other sonic devices you can think of when a scene's playing a little too slow and you want to keep it like free of the composer score? You want to or temp music? What are other tricks in terms of sound that can really help add tension to a scene or add a little extra texture?
Yeah, I mean, sound design is underrated, and it should be thought of, I think, almost the same level as the music. You guys are great at writing sequences that are abstract and sometimes dreamy, right? And, there's all kinds of techniques we can do to bring that out with the sound design. And sometimes having that reverb on dialogue is great. Sometimes having the dialogue become abstract is a great trick, right? Like if we're in a character's head and we don't want to be as aware of what people are saying. We want to communicate that the character is lost in his own thoughts. Having those words kind of disappear, into the distance is like a great trick. And those are things that might be written into the script or might not be. It might be something that we kind of come up with to give the scene a little bit more shape, and to really reinforce the idea that like, no, this is an internal moment, let's just hear this wind that's not really there, but it's in the character's head, let's have the other characters' voices disappear. So those are things that I'm always looking for, and again, in times when, why isn't this coming through? Why isn't this dynamic or exciting? Sometimes there are things we can do with sound that's not just music to emphasize that.
I love that. I love that.
I love that too.
Almost like less words. Just generally, I find like, I tend to write a little too verbose. And I find just less words, like anything you can find to do less words, create more quiet quiet moments of tension or thought or, something happening visually, can often be much, much more powerful. And I love what you're saying, like little tricks like that to thin out some of the words,
Yeah. This is a trick I'd say I learned from another editor. Sometimes one of his go-tos was like, take all the dialogue out of the scene and just have it be visual, right? And maybe that is now playing other music, but sometimes that will like blow your mind. Like, oh my God, just like watching these characters is communicating what we need, and not hearing the words again is like such a strong choice in this case to make it more abstract and more poetic. And those are fun things to kind of look for when you're watching an episode. Just look for opportunities to do that. That's something I'm thinking about.
I love that.
Yeah.
I think that works for comedy too. I'm thinking there's so many times where like somebody will be listening to something, somebody in my family will be listening to something with AirPods, so you can't, or like you're on an airplane. You ever do that when you're standing in line on the airplane for the bathroom and then you end up just watching people's screens? Do you guys ever do that? You're
totally.
watching the screens,
I do that.
so you can't hear it, but you can see. And especially if it's comedy, you know exactly what's going on. Oh, this one's mad at that one. He's surprised about something. The other one rolls his eyes like you always do that. The other one gets irritated by that. You don't have to hear what's happening. It's all, you see the little volleyball back and forth, usually of emotions. And it can be quite, you can get really pulled in.
It's true. I love the thinking sound design too, and in the process of shooting too. I think is always something I've leaned on more and more. I think over time too, of like, okay, we're in a diner. Is there? I mean, the obvious is music playing, and this a diegetic music that plays within a jukebox in the diner, or is there a screen door on the back of that diner that's kind of blowing in the wind? Is there just any of those beds that can you can really do so much in terms of just adding a little bit of tension.
Wow.
Or if you're in a car, there's a radio in that car. Is one of the windows down a little bit? Is it is one of the the car doesn't run perfectly well? Is there a sound that kind of gets under your skin a little bit? There's so many of those things to think about when you get an editorial. And the sound designers will ultimately go and make that all really, really sparkle. And but it's really like you, Rich, when we're in that process where we're adding those ideas and at least putting in like this temp sound design that gives you those feelings. And I think that's it's so effective, but an audience never really consciously notices it. I love that stuff.
Well, there's a little feeling of momentum. If just the backgrounds are changing, like if it's like, the sound of a consistent, like, white noise sound in the background, like, you do that to fall asleep at night because it's lulling, where, I like, that's one thing we always like, let's do more variation, more like, wind starting and stopping, and like just little things changing throughout a scene gives it a lot of life and gives you the feeling of momentum. People rustling around in a courtroom or, whatever those sounds are, just something changing constantly. So that I feel like that really helps.
You guys are mentioning so many great things and so many little tricks about sound. It really makes a difference. Sometimes I feel like, why does the scene feel dead? Where's the energy here? And like you said, sometimes there's a song playing in the background or in the distance, like maybe you're in someone's house, and they're listening to the radio, something as small as that can suddenly make it come to life, and suddenly the pacing works when it didn't before.
That immediately sounds creepy. I'm like, why are they listening to the radio? That's so creepy.
Well, I think too, I think some people might think, okay, the editor is just going to get us through the picture, lock picture. And then, the sound designers will do all that. And the music supervisor will find the music, and the Foley artist will do all the Foley, where the reality is, you, Rich, the picture editor, does kind of all of that. And then those experts will come along later and kind of, do a slightly, more polished version of those things. But it's amazing how much the picture editor is responsible for a first pass of all of it, the music, the sound design, all of it. And it's such a hugely important position.
Yeah, we really do need to present those ideas, I feel, to a sound designer and to a sound team. And sometimes they'll have ideas that we never thought of, and that's great. But again, they don't have the time. We've spent so many weeks on an episode, right? So it's, again, really important to value that time. I start talking with my assistant, at this point, Brian, that you guys know, he's so great with sound. And we have these conversations even as we're putting dailies together. It's like, what do we want this to sound like? What could be playing in the background, especially as we get into our editor's cut. We're like fully collaborating on that. And sometimes I'll call him and I'll get his opinion all the time of like, do you think a song should be playing in the background? What do you think? Okay, could you reach out to the music supervisor and give us some options for this, because it's really like part of a scene. It's really an important element. I don't understand sometimes editors like say they don't work with music or they don't really want to deal with sound. And my thought is, how could you do that? It's part of the scene. It's almost like a performer in the scene, right? It's like, what does it sound like? And so, we're always asking ourselves that question, very early in the process. Knowing those ideas might be questioned and thrown out, and again, the composer, the sound designer might have a totally different take on it, which is also great.
Yeah.
But at least gives them something to start with. And just
that's what it is.
When the studio network watches the first cut, like, that's it. When I hear, I've heard, editors like, well, I'm not a sound editor. Like that, someone will do that down the road. It's like, but kind of the idea of, Drew and I, always try to have the mentality, like always be selling yourself, always, put your best foot forward in every time you're doing anything. And our feeling is always like, well, but the studio network is going to watch this episode and think it's slow and blame the editor. Like, why wouldn't you want to, have all the sparkles in place, right. Why wouldn't you want why wouldn't you want to do that?
And to your point, John, like, I think there's that, that same type of person saying, oh yeah, the sound designers will get to that later. And we're delivering it to the studio and the network. And they know that, those things are still to come. They know that all those things will improve. It's like
they never know.
Like they consciously do know that. Of course they know that, but all they know is this scene feels slow and let's just cut it out. And like sometimes the notes are way bigger than they need to be just because there's some subconscious thing that isn't quite working, and it's usually that extra level of care that editors like yourself really give to an episode, because it does matter. There's just so much of it is just that subconscious engagement, that subconscious feeling of pace and propulsion, and
Editing seems like
huge.
one of those jobs, I might be wrong, but it seems like one of those jobs that people move into and out of. Like sometimes people have a lifelong love for editing, and that's always going to be their job. But I feel like I've heard of a number of people that they do it and then they segue to something else in the business, or, that there's a little ebb and flow. And I wonder, with what you guys are describing, which, honestly sounds like laziness, I wonder if it's laziness that comes out of boredom. I've definitely, as I've shifted through different careers, I've definitely, the less enchanted I get with whatever career I am in, the more bored I get with it, the lazier I get. Right. And I start, phoning it in. So I wonder if there's anything to that of like, and if the opposite is true too, that the more enthusiastic you are, the more passionate you are about what you're doing, probably the more fun you have doing it and the longer you'll want to do it. But
Yeah, those are good points. I think sometimes editors maybe get set in their ways a little bit, they don't have enough variety of experience, and they just say, I do this, they don't want to go out of their box. For me, like I said before, like the years that I spent writing makes me a much better editor, because I, can, again, I think dissect a scene better, in terms of the story points, and the time that I spent, directing documentaries was really helpful to me. Partially because I understand like how hard it is to shoot something and how hard production is, and I understand like there's so many challenges that come up with when you're shooting. So I'm so sympathetic, to that side of it. But it also just helps me be more creatively engaged in more aspects to it. When you make your own film, you're responsible for all of it. So, you don't just say this is someone else's job. I want like to be involved. So yeah, I think like staying like engaged, and sometimes, like you said, it's like doing different things in life. It can be something that's not a different part of your career, but just a hobby, it can be cool, like doing photography, or, sometimes I do things with like sound design just on my own, just experiments in audio, that's something that like keeps me engaged with that part of the craft. So then maybe I have something new to bring to a TV show. I've learned something new out in the world in a hobby. Now I can bring it to what I do with you guys.
I love that.
I love that too. That's awesome.
Let's get into the rapid fire 4.
Rich, what is the first television show you truly loved and why?
All right. I'm going to say the first television I truly loved was The Wire, because that show blew my mind. It was just so subtle in the way of storytelling. I felt like I had to be so engaged with this show as a viewer. I had to be so invested in the little details to like get to the payoff. And I'd never experienced a show quite like that. And I feel even to this day, sometimes what we do, it has to be so immediate now. Everything needs to like land with such a big impact. And when I watched that show, I don't know, there was like a subtlety to it and a trust in the audience that I feel is very rare.
I love
Couldn't
that.
agree more. Couldn't agree more. It's like, it's almost hard to, it's like almost so many people's favorite show ever. And it's almost hard to imagine it getting made now,
Right.
5 seasons of that show being made now is almost hard to imagine. Okay. Second question. What is your favorite part of the job?
Favorite part of the job? I mean, it would be easy for me to say cutting performances. I do think that is my favorite part of the job, just because I feel so engaged with the story when I'm cutting performance. There's something about a performance when it really rises to that place where it becomes magical to me. Like, I don't understand acting, so when I see someone perform a scene that like takes me out of my world and into the story of the show, it just, I don't know, it just transports me there. And like I said, I just become emotionally invested. So getting to like have a part in shaping that performance, I feel very honored to do it, and I see a performance that was obviously so well delivered and so much emotion and passion behind it, it makes me want to rise to that level and really like contribute on that same level that the actor brought to the performance.
What is the part of the job that costs you something?
Well, Schedules that are unrealistic cost me weekends, you could say. but maybe a better answer is like inefficient workflows also, I think cost all of us, right? I think when we spend our time doing things that aren't moving the ball forward, we all get frustrated. And not only does it cost us our weekends, and it costs us our enriching personal life, which is important to have and to bring back to the work that we do, but it also just takes away the joy of, the process. So that's something that I always think about is like, are we honoring the process and are we working as efficiently as possible, and consider wasting time like something that really costs us something creatively.
I love that.
Yeah.
I feel like there
couldn't
should
agree
be a
more.
whole episode just on that. I'm like, because we're too late in the episode for me to ask, but I'm like what? Like, what are these inefficiencies? We have to eradicate them. But that's for another day.
That's for another day.
Number
But
4.
There's a lot.
If you had a time machine, what advice would you give yourself when you started your television journey?
Ooh. Okay, well, this is a little self-helpy maybe, but if I had a time machine, I would go back and just tell myself to like enjoy the process more and to have more fun, because I can think back on earlier times when there was so much worry, whether it was creatively, how am I doing on a show? What are they going to think of my work? Where's my career going? All these worries. And I feel like now I'm in a place where I just appreciate doing this so much. The creative process, getting to work with you guys and people at your level is like such an honor that, I'm really able to appreciate it. And I know someday I won't do this anymore, and I'll look back and think that was so cool that I got to do that. And so I feel like I wish I'd spend more time appreciating the process, and really honoring it. But I'm glad that at some point that kind of clicked in and I was able to, in the moment, say, this is so cool that I get to do this.
If you like our show, please consider taking a minute to subscribe or follow, and please rate us real high. Give us 6 out of 5. Wherever you get your podcasts, and please tell a friend. That's really nice. Just do that little arrow that shares with them. That all really helps us find our audience. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here and listening. And Rich, that was so great. That was so
Rich
interesting.
Fox, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, you guys.
We could have done 4 episodes with you easily.
Yep, for
Totally.
sure.
That was so much fun.
Yeah, really
Loved
appreciate it, Rich. Hopefully we'll see you in editorial as soon as possible.
I can't wait.
Yes.
Let's do it.